Welcome to the second plenary session of the Congress. My name is Susie Lee and I'm the Vice President for Task Forces for IUFRO. So this morning I have the pleasure of introducing our second plenary speaker for the Congress, and he is none other than Professor David Newbery. David Newbery is Faculty Professor for Vegetation, Ecology and at the Institute for Plant Sciences at the University of Bern in Switzerland, and his main focus is on tropical forest ecology. His other areas of expertise lie in data analysis and theoretical ecology. He was educated in the UK and lectured there until 1996. His work is largely of a fundamental nature, though sometimes with a view to application in forest management. He has a long list of publications, but most of them have three characteristic features. That is, a long-term commitment through field work at key sites, the ecosystem community level of inquiry, and the corresponding theory and statistical modeling that's involved. He has also been a long-term editor of the Journal of Tropical Ecology, some of whom I'm sure who would be familiar with it. In 1985, he initiated the research program at the Danam Valley in Sabah, Malaysia, and he continues research there today. He was instrumental in the establishment of the now world-famous, world-class Tropical Research Institute at the Danam Valley. I first got to know David when we collaborated together on a European Union-funded project back in the 1990s, looking at the survival and regeneration of dipterocarps in Malaysia. Apart from research in Malaysia, David has also done a lot of work in West Africa, mainly in Corrib National Park in the southwest Cameroon, and he has sustained a detailed program of research there until today. And that area is one of the most significant refugia in Africa. So the central aim of David's research has been to reach a deeper understanding of tree growth and survival and forest dynamics set in an ecosystem framework. These topics and experiences have strongly shaped his ongoing interest in philosophy of science applied to problems of ecosystem dynamics. So today it is now my pleasure to invite David to give us his lecture. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Susie, and thank you very much for this invitation to speak here at this conference. So, in this lecture, I've tried to orientate my experience in tropical forest research as an ecologist to what might be of interest to foresters. What is there new to consider that's coming from ecology? What needs to be reconsidered? What needs to be abandoned? The main message will be about ecosystem structure and dynamics, the role of environmental stochasticity, and our capabilities in prediction over time. Many people present here are concerned with forest management, forest health and hazards, forest stock and production. So our common ground is the likelihood of events, how they can be measured and analyzed. I believe it's time to return to some basic science in forestry, think more laterally, not rush ahead so fast, and be a bit more reflective and modest. My thoughts come from two sources: realizations about how the real natural world is and seems to work, and considering what ecology is as a science. In conducting long-term research at two sites in particular, I've been searching for alternative, possibly better theories and models of forest dynamics. So if after 30 minutes you take away a couple of key points which may lead you to redesign your research program, think again about your management plan, scale up or down as appropriate your findings in a more realistic way, I might have succeeded. But also, I do have a proposal to make, which I shall come to during the talk. Some of what I'm going to say will come across as maybe rather controversial and even provoking. So please, it's not my intention to criticize anyone or any theory, but simply to ask for a wider debate on issues which I feel are very important. It is no understatement, surely, to say that how we handle the forest natural resource is and will be having far-reaching implications for mankind and the planet. Before I get into the first part of the talk, I'd like to mention that I won't be citing too many pieces of work, but all of what I'm talking about, not all of it is so very new, you will find in my publications and fully cited there. So, ecology is a special science, as we say, built upon physics and evolutionary thinking. The one entity, call it concept or term, that is special to ecology is the ecosystem. And how ecosystems vary over time is described by their dynamics. We recognize a system by it being made up of interrelated parts that give it an integrated whole. And this is characterized by cycles, feedback, and regulation. I'm not suggesting that such systems have irreducible emergent properties or that they can evolve as units under selection, but they do have collective properties that can be measured physically. What keeps them together, their cohesion and integration, is no more than the co-evolved biological processes between the parts. A forest is composed of one, a few, or several different species of tree, fungi, invertebrates, and animals, and the whole functions as a collective response to environment externally and its interactions internally. The ecosystem idea in recent decades has been slowly abandoned. Some argue that it does not exist, others that it's useless, and some that it's just too complex. The ecosystem is often mistaken for a community of several populations of different species, or simply, as often, it's being used for a label instead of just saying the forest. Ecology is seen by other scientists as a very difficult pursuit because of what it aims at and the means by which it tries to grasp those aims that are often appearing to be insuperable. Perhaps the aims are not quite right. Must ecology always be couched in terms of the diverse, the complex, and the wonderful? There are many relatively species-poor, manageable, and not necessarily dull tropical forests that are still very interesting to study. The pursuit of unattainable goals has led us into dangerous metaphysics where knowing it all and having one model for it all is becoming a dream. I believe that more ecologists should come back down to earth and tackle simpler systems, ones that can be manipulated, observed, and modeled effectively by incorporating their system properties. Not all ecosystems are and have to be so complex and diverse to make them worthy of ecological investigation, and hence forever more out of our reach. Natural systems are in continual flux, rarely show equilibrium characteristics for more than short periods, if we are around to catch them. And how would we know about them unless we had very long times of observation? For several decades, from the 1960s to 2000, a very large part of ecological research, especially in the field of one and two species population dynamics, assumed for mathematical convenience that nature was stable and had equilibria, and mostly ecosystems were made up of niche apportioned organisms. Although serious doubts and mounting evidence began in the 1970s, it took a long time for the paradigm to shift to what many now recognize as the non-equilibrium view. There is no a priori reason to assume equilibria as far as taxonomic evolutionary entities are concerned. But in terms of the functioning ecosystem, based on the operating species in physical terms, then clearly forests can stabilize, maintain biomass and production levels over time, based on physical principles. This can be achieved often with relatively few tree species. The forester's aim, presumably, is to provide at least a tree cover to maintain a system and protect the soil. A major drive in ecology has been an attempt to generalize, to find principles or laws, but none has come forward. Several researchers have analyzed why this situation has arisen. Ecology is a special science, so perhaps if there is a generality, it is that there is no generality. This is because of the nature of the subject. However, without robust guidelines, principles, even a theory, practitioners like foresters have little to apply. Decision-making, policy enactment, and management become very vague, falling back on ingrained myths, self-evident truths or hunches, sometimes hangovers from those optimistic ecology and something courses in the 1980s. Does ecology need laws to function as a science? And so often we discover that it is the detail that is so important in what we're studying. The study sites, especially tropical ones, point to the need for precise information there and then to make progress at all. Trying to translate across sites, use patterns gleaned elsewhere or earlier, become simply too inaccurate with large error bars on parameter estimates, not to mention the conditionality of each and every study. Models become caricatures of nature. I think the search for generality, for global answers and for patterns, or the grand synthesis, should be resisted. My message is that we must know our system in detail. As science progresses, we do accumulate more and more valuable information on the basic mechanisms, especially those couched in physiological and physical terms. But the main processes remain diffuse and hard to tie down. Often it's fine when we have single causes, linear effects, controlled conditions, repeatability, the hallmarks of what we all learnt about what is proper science. But once we step up to multiple causes, non-linear and interacting effects, a changing landscape, and definitely very rarely repeatable conditions, then all becomes a bit indeterminate quite rapidly. The real world, the one that actually affects, the one we measure empirically, is multi-causal and non-linear. And if we stay with simple systems, we must not be too surprised sometimes that they lack relevance. Any laws that may come are going to be more complex than is presently admitted by science. If we allow everything to become all too complex and diverse, the tendency is to drift into a sort of metaphysics like many biodiversity studies. Natural history inventories are fine, but let's not make a selling issue out of ecology and keep calling it biodiversity. Diversity is a highly abstract idea from other sciences. Trees in populations are simply not the same as atoms of a gas in thermodynamics theory. They are not bits of information as messages. This analogy has been pushed so far as to end up with community models that cannot be tested scientifically. However, relative abundances of species in time and space are quite understandable and should be kept and analyzed as such. To continue as we are, our subject becomes obscure, one that is mystifying as those strange notions of the 1960s like the balance of nature. From my own somewhat idiosyncratic experiences and reflections, I feel we need some rethinking, and with it, some honesty about what we wish to do and can do. would it not be more sensible, even pragmatic, to aim at medium complex systems over mid-time spans, avoiding the very artificial single species ones at one extreme and the hopelessly, extremely variable, diverse ones at the other? We need to understand how nature functions, exercise control through management, through these pragmatic approaches at the mid-level. This, for me, is the next challenge in main science, not just ecology. Even so, middle-sized systems are the ones most feared by modelers. They cannot have their nice differential equations that lead to neat equilibrium solutions in microecology, and they cannot hide in the rarefied regions of diversity in macroecology. The approach I'm advocating is none other than the old Aristotelian middle way, admittedly the most difficult for humans when facing natural phenomena. To do this, I see no other approach than to explore the ecosystem concept afresh. Without any form of postulate, there can logically be no theory upwards or hypotheses downwards when reasoning. The ecosystem postulate is needed to allow us to model, experiment, measure, and manage forests. Variation in space has been well catered for by sampling and statistical analysis with a large range of tools that are essentially maps. But again, variation in time is far more intractable, and it's the one that we seem to be most drawn to as humans. We seem seduced by the idea that we can predict. How many aspects of professional and everyday life are not immersed in making or using forecasts? If one works with organisms that are small, have short lifetimes, and therefore fast turnover rates, perhaps as 1 or 2 species systems, but note, not 3, as prediction suddenly becomes much harder to handle, then some quite reasonable models seem to work. So who claims to be able to predict with N species models? As we move to longer lifespans, slower turnovers, larger organisms like trees, our inability to cope with time variation escalates. For one, we observe and record such small windows of time ourselves, a glimpse in a multi-age stage tree population, and then we use all sorts of assumptions and proxies to speculate about the future, if this and that and not this and that, and so forth. For the other, we then argue, sometimes unfortunately wrongly, that what we observed in the past is representative of the present and the future. Yet, we often simply do not know, and we should admit that, and not keep trying to pretend about our knowledge, which time and again has been shown to be inaccurate and sometimes misleading. There is, of course, as you know, no known answer to this problem of induction, right up to Hume and today, about how to be perfectly confident about the future. Really, it seems that collecting more data is not helping at the moment. And the more we record, it seems the worse our generalizations are becoming, the less we're being able to predict, which in itself seems paradoxical. Meta-analyses, big means, global synthesis cannot help the situation unless there is a theory, a postulate, a calculating principle that can take into account local conditions and details at the middle level. And I'm advocating the meso-ecosystem level, determining its stability and dynamics. Trees live a long time and experience varying environmental conditions over their lifetimes. The natural world is noisy, especially climatically, with centuries-spaced major events, decadal scale disturbances, and continuous change down to the annual perturbations. The frequency of these scales we summarize in something called spectral analysis. A spectrum has a color which indicates the predominant frequencies. The world is pink-red. Living with our rose-tinted spectacles, has prevented us from seeing this. And to pretend that population dynamics is subject just to white noise is little relevant other than for error estimations. Or that things will surely even out in the long run. Or worse still, nature has surely dealt with this by now, is rather naive. All would be well if the ecological world was made up of straight lines, additive effects, independent causes, and so on. But the evidence in the last 15 years shows that quite unequivocally it is not. It is a lagged, multiple, overlapping, non-linear, and full of surprises. That noise is a major driver of variation and complexity and instability has only recently been seriously recognized. Before, it was an embarrassing inconvenience that some clever statistical routine could smooth away. If we were, therefore, to admit more temporal variability in ecology and forestry, I'm sure we would become a little bit more humble, even reticent, and certainly not be touting those next 500-year model runs, which, in any case, will never be tested and hence lie outside of normal science. And we would, above all, be more cautious, because a common mistake in ecology is to assume the so-called ceteris paribus clause, or condition, other things being equal, and other things very rarely are equal all the same. Forest ecology needs to move to middle systems, but with even a few tree species, trouble very quickly ensues with unpredictable outcomes. We are learning, but it seems we're not learning fast enough. Forestry has often failed to pick up on the important messages recently coming from ecology, possibly because the messages are coded for them. An image given over about saving, serving, and satisfying does not sound too practical to those who grow trees as crops. Ecological management suggestions are often too much at variance with other goals, come too late, and are impractical to implement. I would like to encourage more thinking on this meso-ecosystem level to ensure that in 1, 2, 3 species mixture, planted or managed or semi-natural, the ecosystem properties are brought in, shown, and maintained. But these have to be worked out for each and every site where the relevant details must be incorporated. There seems to be no alternative. The tendency to make all-purpose general models allow models laterally cannot, as systems differ too legally, because they differ by their defining factors. The detail does matter. History. Ecology is a historical science, as its former name indicated, in natural history. History does not, at least anymore, seek laws. It tries to understand the past intelligibly, and it's like ecology, it is highly context dependent. We speak of ecosystems being contingent. That is, they depend on the combination of all factors operating at one time and place. Not just the past in terms of evolution and adaptation is important, but rather too are historical events for forests and trees. All of us know several examples of major disturbances or changes that led to a forest being in part how it is today. How can we make sense of the present, or even suggest something about the near future, without a strong historical insight? Since the equilibrium concept is not tenable, it is also not valid to say a population has no memory. What saves ecology, however, is the house, the ecos, and with the house, the system. I know of no other term, concept, or notion that distinguishes ecology from other biological sciences, although the word system is common to many sciences and is used consistently across them. Ideas of ecosystem and natural history need to be integrated with more awareness and modeling of noise, or what we call environmental stochasticity. What are the consequences for admitting that we do not know enough detail how to understand fully what we want to manage? Well, one way is simply to be cautious. Leave alone, don't interfere, protect. That's the conservation approach. This might be all right for 10% of the world's forests, but the other 90% immediately affected by and needed by humans require careful management. Another approach is the portfolio, a combination of strategies, each watched carefully over time, and as one works better, the others are modified towards it. A third way is to postulate that behind these dynamics may be stabilizing processes that all should be done to manage towards them, since if nature shows us correctly, an ecosystem will economize, and while it may not necessarily conserve species per se, it will maintain processes that conserve resources. And conserving and reusing natural resources should be our highest priority. So for an ecosystem scientist, the guiding principle is nature does not waste. I come to illustrate in the second part of my talk a few examples from my own work that have led me to this sort of interim position in the thinking. They come from Sabah in northeast Borneo and from southwest Cameroon, Corrib. After close to 30 years involvement at both sites, I feel I'm only just beginning to understand what is going on. The reason is clear. The long-term nature of the processes behind tree dynamics. The sites are very different, so certainly no generalizations will follow, except perhaps that both of them have a lot of trees. In Sabah, at Danum, we have been following small to large tree dynamics since 1986 in 2 4-hectare permanent plots, and we have made 4 main censuses so far. It's lowland dipterocarp forest. A notable environmental feature is that in 1998 there was a strong ENSO, El Nino Southern Oscillation event in the region, set against a usually quite equable tropical climate. So we have tracked the dynamics before, during, and after. There was another one in '83, so you see we started in the tail of a lag phase from a previous one. The effects of '98 still resonate in 2007 and, as new results are showing, in 2014-15. Here then was a perturbation that strongly affected growth but had only moderate effects on mortality. Consider what a perturbation does. Just in parentheses, a perturbation means that an environmental factor affects a forest but doesn't cause a large amount of loss of biomass as you would have in a disturbance. Such a perturbation, to see how complex is the response of the forest. As the accumulated rainfall deficit declined to its minimum of April that year, it took time, of course, different species of different sizes at different topographic locations began to be stressed earlier or later. Then different ones had different degrees of resistance, resilience, and overcompensation. Some were well adapted, apparently, others not so. Some even benefited. It also became clear that the forest was in a late stage of long-term recovery from a major disturbance in 1878. History counts. And so these ENSO setbacks, once every 15 years or so, were perturbing the smooth return to maximum site capacity. Analyzing mortality, recruitment, and growth rates over intervals allowed us to develop a response index, which in turn led to a new type of stability analysis. I'd like to just go over a few of the main results from Danum very quickly, and then afterwards I'll show you a few slides of one illustrating this. Several main results came out of the research at Danum, but in an unexpected way. Firstly, the dynamics of the forest is what we have called pluralistic, echoing a pluralistic philosophical position it's not so much neutral or random, and it's not simply niche defined. It means that continual perturbations to ecosystems generate manifold complex responses across species in time, all mixed together rather like a kaleidoscopic image. Since the forest is species rich, imagine then how the neighborhoods of trees then vary over time between one another and their nonlinear outcomes. Individual tree growth rates are very variable, meaning that the overlap between species rates is often very high, and this has large consequences for dynamics. Recruitment is partly dependent on growth, and so is mortality. The understory species dominated by euphorbs responded positively to the drought perturbation, even with overcompensation up to 3 to 4 years afterwards. This led us to propose an understory facilitation hypothesis, which says that the understory provides a natural protection or nursing role for the drought-sensitive saplings and small trees of the overstory, mostly the dipterocarps. In other words, foresters must not remove the understory of so-called useless trees because they're integral to the recovery and stability of the system. This advice has made me quite unpopular in some circles over the years. There is a trade-off in functional response, not just across light and shade, but in resistance and resilience to drought. In our neighborhood regression modeling, we found strong conspecific effects amongst the dominant dipterocarp species in the 10-year period before the ENSO event. Yet, these disappeared in the period afterwards over the next 11 years, which had the drought. Interactions and nearest neighbors do not stay constant over time, even if you measure them for one 10-year period. And in this context, we were also surprised to see how much the neighborhood basal area not only changed spatially with a coefficient of variation of 30%, but it changed over 21 years by 10%. This is quite considerable. Clearly, we need to work more with variances. Lastly, using the so-called Fokker-Planck diffusion equations to model tree size frequency distributions at Dunham, I was struck how inadequate were my 21-year mortality and growth rates. These were evidently not the same rates that were applying in the past. Here then is a complex system, apparently, but it can be simplified into 3-part of overstory, understory, and the soil matrix. Let me just quickly show 1 or 2 results. All these you will find, except 1 or so, in recent publications, so please do go to my website and papers if you're interested to read in more detail. This is the track of the ENSO event in '98. It's an accumulated rainfall deficit graph, and you see this nice dip in green and blue line, which shows you how the drought began to progress in relation to our measurement periods in the site. This is our environmental perturbation. This is the understory facilitation hypothesis in a very simplified form from an earlier paper. The round dipterocarp trees in the overstory, the little square-boxed euphorbs in the understory, lead in the bottom diagram to the bottom right the idea of this reciprocal feedback between overstory and understory, so to say, helping each other in the long-term dynamics and stability. And above, the idea that not everything is a light trade-off in the understory. It is also to do with drought, which we have shown in physiological experiments. The response index measures the percentage change from one time period to the next, and so you can follow the differences between species between periods. Here's an example for the first 2 periods we studied, and you see how variable species are in mortality, recruitment, and growth, the percentage change from one time period to the next. We can build these into a so-called stability analysis, which is quite new, which plots the response index between, say, one period and the next one, and one period and the subsequent one. And we look to see from these quadrants and octants in this diagram which species are drifting away over time, which are coming back and stabilizing, and which are showing an oscillating behavior. And it's fascinating that so many species show these damped oscillation behavior. Variability among species in growth rates, here's just one example, relative growth rate in stem relative growth rates. The bars are confidence limits at 95%. Just look how variable they are and the degree of overlap between species. The neighborhood study I mentioned also showed this loss of conspecific effect. Here you see a red line that describes the density-dependent effect across the dipterocarps of the strength of conspecific interaction, the effect of big trees on smaller ones, against Monte Carlo simulations in the colored bands. 10 years later, it had more or less disappeared. Why did it disappear? And the basal area modeling around trees makes the point that over time, the environment of individuals is changing greatly over periods of, say, 10 to 20 years. Let me now come to Corrib. The setup in Corrib in Western Central Africa is rather different. As Richards remarked decades ago, African forests are special with their localized species dominance in patches and mosaics. Many people are not aware of this great difference in structure between forests across the world. Its paucity in middle-sized trees and its lower species richness. Corrib provides perhaps the best site in Africa to follow natural dynamics of the region's main family of trees called the Caesalpiniaceae. Here, on highly leached low P and K soils, under annually very wet climate, yet with one clear dry season, there are groves, big complex patches of these several Caesalp trees. One in particular we have researched with the species Microbelinea bisulcata. Microbelinea bisulcata and the other Caesalps are ectomycorrhizal and mass-fruiting. In some groves, MB dominates with 2 Tetrabelinea species, and it shows this mosaic structure that was first articulated so well by Aubreville in 1938 in Côte d'Ivoire, and nicely illustrated by the work of René Letouze in Cameroon. However, despite the fact that MB is a high forest, huge trees with buttressing, it's so clearly physiologically and physically adapted to the sandy soils of Corrib, it's failing almost completely to regenerate in situ. At least just now it is, and we must not fall into thinking that an equilibrium forest is the state, because it may not have been. So over the decades, we set about recording dynamics, making factors, many factors that affect seedling establishment and sapling survival, light, nutrients, pathogens, predators of seeds, seedling herbivory mycorrhizas, all of them which form a set of interrelated processes. I'll try to summarize very briefly some points related to the environmental noise issue. Microbelinea groves are very highly ectomycorrhizal, and they have a very thin surface layer of organic matter, a bit like a carpet lying over the soil, and it has 60% more phosphorus than the surrounding forest without these species. Most of it is in low molecular weight organic form. The ECM Caesalps withdraw about half as much phosphorus before senescence than other species, and they drop phosphorus-rich litter onto the forest floor. Onto a phosphorus-poor soil, you ask? Indeed, this is because this P is almost completely trapped and held in the fine root mycorrhizal mat. Decomposition is not carbon-phosphorus ratio limited, and the turnover to the tree before the wet season is very fast. This led to the fast-forward cycle idea we published, which was completely at variance to establish wisdom, or shall I say dogma, that in nutrient-poor habitats, litter accumulates and cycles are slow. Microbelinea is very shade intolerant as a seedling, but it is very light responsive when you give it light. It even grows in the open as small plantations. It has small seeds. You might say, oh, this is some sort of pioneer. But wait, this species, like many others, grow very fast as trees. They have huge crowns, big buttress systems, live to 250 years. This does not fit with the wisdom of a simple bipartite trade-off in life history strategies that we all learnt of. Another arm was needed, not so for African trees. We suggested that long-lived, light-responding tree species were a major group contributing to the dynamics. Although in reality, of course, all species fit to some extent on a continuum in behavior. The Caesalps, exemplified by Microbelinea, have a modal size and age distribution. But so do 45% of other canopy tree species in Corrib and Douala Adir. They lack the small stems. And from our models, we see that often there is no way that a stable size structure can be maintained when using just current information. We have to admit long-term non-equilibrium dynamics, sometimes at scales that are hard to understand, where sets of multiple dry year disturbances recorded for Central and West Africa over the centuries drive large pulses of establishment. The patches mature, fail to replace, and await decline in order to replace later in situ, sometimes aided by stochastic events. Hence, the dominance we see in Microbelinea is transient, and we suggest that this process is much more common than has been previously recognized. Nevertheless, lastly, we were also surprised at the high variation in growth rates amongst trees and their ages. Such insights have huge consequences for thinking about conservation and management. You might say you want to have what you see in front of you right now, but is that really what one should be conserving or moving to management when it's part of a long-term cycle? Changes, how much change are we willing to tolerate in our thinking and then in nature? Or is it the other way around? So a few quick examples for Corrib. Here's a map of the Microbelinea Grove, about 1,000 map trees. Here are our two main permanent plots that we've set up, and you see this grove structure. And within one of such plots, we can work with Microbelinea, 2 tetrabelineas, and we lump everything else together of all the other species. And there you see how quite complex and variable is the spatial variation between the species. This leads us to working with a simple system of 3 main species interacting and following their dynamics, shown by this ternary diagram, which is the relative abundance of the 3 main Caesalp species. Here's the peak in Microbelinea, typical of these species that appear not to be recruiting at the moment, but obviously later or somewhere else perhaps, compared with 2 tetrabelinear species which are doing what most foresters call the reverse J classical recruitment curve. And the mycorrhizas in their cycling. Here's a little diagram to summarize work we did on phosphorus, and on the diagram on the left you see the mycorrhizas lead to this fast-forward cycle that leads to a high conservation. This is the system component, the cycling part that's important. And on the other side, forest roundabout that lacks it, that has a much slower, leakier, less conservative cycling. Variation against time. If you plot the nice curves, well, they look like nice curves. But when you realize the scatter around such curves, you realize that individuals are so variable in their individual experiences and growth rates. Trying to predict, hesitantly, even as much as 25 and 50 years, which I'm not comfortable with, we try to look and see how the population of this grove will change. And we see that the very large trees made up of Microbelinea, the darker bars, are not changing much. The system is sitting there, hanging there, probably waiting for something to happen, and the other species are turning over around it like this. We tried to see what would happen when we altered the mortality of the big trees. The question obviously is, well, if the big trees die faster suddenly, will the medium-sized trees come up behind them and replace them and give a stable age-size distribution? The answer is, at the moment, no. Even if you elevate recruitment into large and medium-sized classes, you will not be able to replace those large trees quick enough to maintain some sort of stable structure. It's non-equilibrium dynamics. So I come to my conclusions, and then I finish as quickly as possible. So I'm advocating a better recognition and more attention and thinking about the role of environmental stochasticity, or colored noise as it's often called, for forest ecosystem dynamics. We need ecosystems, but not quite so complex ones that are much more usable and manageable. Hence the postulate of a meso-ecosystem structure that represents what the system is doing, particularly if it's made up of 3 or at most 4 parts to follow dynamics. We need moderation and some pragmatism here, and they're obviously called for in order to make some progress. Whilst there's been much research done on structural equation modeling, in forestry too, of multi-causal processes, it has been almost exclusively made with so-called acyclic graphs. I know of only one attempt to analyze causes of dynamics in a cyclic graph. In other words, something close to an ecosystem. I suggest that a better model of species richness and dynamics is a more pluralistic one. It admits variation at the individual level, is more mechanistic and more realistic. Very importantly, we must leave the land of hope about all is in balance, species-wise anyway, and try to work out non-equilibrium dynamics on a much stronger basis. It's not going to be easy. Finally, if we do think we understand our ecosystem well, then predictions can be useful when reasonably and reliably made. To improve success, it seems that a simpler and robust ecosystem approach is needed, one that must define the cycles, the lags, and the feedbacks that can quantify stabilization processes. Otherwise, in forest ecology, as the old adage is, no prediction is better than a bad prediction. It seems there is little substitute either for long-term study and continuity as a basis for really good management. As a coder, I would like to mention and acknowledge the thinking of an American philosopher, a pragmatist called Charles Sanders Peirce. He had a great affinity for 3-part systems in logic, in science, and in metaphysics. He was drawn to triangles. A triangle allows the simplest system cycle. A triangle admits nonlinearity and trade-off. A triangle can represent several types of thinking. In ecology, the well-known Levenscian triangle, which you may have heard of, is generality, precision, and relevance. You can't have all 3 at once. Peirce advocated abduction as the main means to work in the special sciences, like his own geology and in ecology, a process of measurement followed by hypothesis, model, or postulate, as opposed to the deductive approach in maths and the inductive one in hard sciences. So I'm wondering about how these triangles can work and how we can put structural form, the system, stability detection, and predictive ability together much better. Where within these triangles is the middle way that best advances our knowledge in the service of man's intervention of nature? I'm not really willing to admit with Feyerabend that anything goes, but my analysis should show why serious ecology is rather difficult, and general principles or laws presently do evade us. I leave you to ponder over these ideas and ask you to reconsider ecology in the light of this thinking in the last years. I'd like to acknowledge all my colleagues and students and people I've discussed these ideas with over the years, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, David, for a very interesting and provocative talk. We have about 10 minutes for questions and answers, so whoever would like to ask questions, please go up to the mics on the floor, on your right and left, and you can address your questions to David. Yes, please, on the right.
Hello, I'm Eric from University of São Paulo, Brazil. We used to manage our forest, our tropical forest, in blocks of each one is exploring in each 30 years. I think, based on your talk, probably 30 years is not enough to recover all the forest explored. So can we say about how much time we should wait until revisited an area based on the ecology issues?
If I've understood the question, how long should one wait until?
30 years.
30 years?
Yeah.
In order to?
Revisit the same area.
Revisit the same area.
To revisit the same area. To make measurements and to?
No, to explore the same area, we wait for 30 years, then we come back in the same area to explore it again.
Oh, I see. Well, I think it would be difficult to say that it would be 30 years. It would depend on the turnover of the species populations, the ecology of the species involved, and the variability or the factors in the environment. Maybe 5 years would be necessary, repeated over longer time. 30 years for me seems a long time on which to judge the dynamics of a forest.
Do we have another question? No? No more questions? Yes?
Peter Friss-Smith, Forestry Commission, GB.
Could you speak a little bit closer to the microphone?
Certainly. Peter Friss-Smith, UK. Is it naive to interpret your overall message that we are probably wrong to try and manage for resilience and stability?
No. No, not at all. We must aim for trying to understand stability of forest systems, of which resilience is perhaps a part. I'm just advocating that we need better tools at a more intermediate level to model this with the necessary information for each particular site. No, certainly, stability is perhaps one of the main things, as we showed with Danum with the oscillating species and the return after the perturbations. There is a lot of mixing going on, species are varying, but the basic structure of the overstory, understory is remarkably constant over 21 years we have at the moment. And likewise in Corrib, where you have a nutrient cycle that will, of course, be affected as those big trees die and replace themselves over time. But the idea is that the forest will stabilize in the long term, and we need to understand the mechanisms behind that.
Thank you. Another question? Yes, please. The one on the right first,
yes,
and the second, yeah.
I start?
Yes,
or?
you, please.
Okay. You were talking about environmental stochasticity. In my scientific socialization, I always thought that we're living in a non-Markovian world, and that what you call stochasticity is just a switch between ergodic and non-ergodic behavior. Could you please comment on that?
A switch between ergodic and non-ergodic?
Yes.
That I can't tell. That I don't know how to answer. Stochasticity is essentially this not quite random, but variation in the environment that is coming with a certain repeated, for instance, certain things come, like an El Nino drought might come once every 15 years, but it doesn't come exactly every 15 years. Sometimes the interval is 7, sometimes it's 18, sometimes it's 13. It's very variable. But we know that this variability is there within a certain window of time. And that is extremely difficult for the species to adapt to or predict to, that type of variability.
Okay, thank you. That answered my question, actually. So it's the non-ergodic phases of growth that are interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. This gentleman over here, please.
Thank you. My name is Harry Purnama from C4 and Bogor Agriculture University. Yeah, I totally agree with you on the complexity and also the dynamics of the ecosystem. That's why we come up with the concept of adaptive management. For a long time, actually, it's already 20 years, we talk about the adaptive management of the ecosystem management. It means whatever our intervention, whatever our action, whatever our management to the ecosystem, like a hypothesis that we have to test in the real life, in the real ecosystem. I'm wondering if you have comments on the idea of the adaptive ecosystem in terms of whether it is quite good, quite success in managing the complexity of the ecosystem. Am I understood?
Yeah. No, thank you for the question. Well, first of all, I don't believe that an ecosystem itself can adapt. That's not possible if one also follows Darwinian natural selectionist thinking. It's the species within the system that are doing the adaptation, that are responding to the environment, but they are tied to one another through their biotic and other interactions that make the whole community or ecosystem. So if changes are happening, it's due to the species themselves that are becoming adapted to this environmental regime. So for instance, like Microbelinea and other Caesalps in Africa, obviously they have a life history strategy that has met environmental variation maybe once every 100 years in the form of these dry periods. And so over evolutionary time, the forest structure has been built up of the species that are responding to it. And then these species are functioning physically in terms of their water relations, phosphorus cycling, and everything that feed back on recruitment, growth, and so forth. So I must say, there's been a lot of debate in the literature about adaptive ecosystems, but as a biologist, I find it very hard to work with that concept.
Okay, perhaps you can take your discussion further with David later on. And we have another question from the young lady over there. Yes.
Yes, thank you for your talk, Kathleen McGinley, U.S. Forest Service. In considering the results that you presented, I just wonder if forest management practices have changed, taking into consideration some of the findings in the forest or in the areas where you have done this work or in the countries, or if at the higher level policy has changed in regard to forest management.
Well, I only have a little experience in tropical countries that are close to where we have worked, for instance, in Malaysia and in Western Central Africa. When it comes to management of the forest, there is a tendency that people make decisions based on information from a short time period or study that they see in front of them. They measure a forest for 5 years. They look at, say, the potential recruitment of species, and then they act in some way maybe to restrict or improve maybe regeneration of species without realizing that the low recruitment is part of a natural long-term cycle that is there in nature. And it's a mistake, in other words, to go against or to interfere with that natural dynamics. And therefore, I've seen several mistakes in forest silviculture and management that have simply worked with a sort of general textbook model of how a forest should grow in terms of producing wood, and yet it's obviously not appropriate to the ecology of the system they're working with. And I think we need to have far more recognition of these longer-term processes that are happening in forests, even though what I'm saying, I know, is incompatible with socio-economic goals of production and management. But nevertheless, from an ecological side, we've observed how things vary, are not in perfect equilibrium or stable size structure over time. And we've also learned that short-term measurements can really mislead us into what the forest might be in 30, 50, 100 years' time.
Thank you. I think that is a perfect time to end this session. So thank you all for staying back for this session, and thank you again, David, for an excellent talk, and I hope you've got people thinking now. Thank you.